Summertime in Europe, the beaches of the French Riviera and Côte d'Azur. Millions of tourists bask in the sunshine. The cafes and bars of Paris, Vienna, Rome, and Barcelona overflow with tourists and locals alike. On the island of Ibiza and across the Greek islands, the party never stops. That's how it's been for decades. But now La Dolce Vita, the good life, is about to disappear. The summer of 2025 will be the last summer of peace in Europe because Russia will attack Europe in the fall. That is the stark warning issued by German military historian Professor Sönke Neitzel. Even worse, he says, Europe, and in particular Germany, is nowhere near ready to confront the threat. Let's take a look at what may be the last summer of peace in Europe. Neitzel certainly has the credentials to make such bold claims. The 56-year-old is a prominent German military expert and historian who has written extensively about the Second World War. He is the editor of the journal German History in the 20th Century and has written or co-written several books on the subject. He's been a professor of military history at the University of Potsdam for a decade, having moved there from the London School of Economics in 2015. In a recent interview with Bild, he stated that he believes Russia could attack Lithuania as early as this fall. Why? Well, we are witnessing a global security situation that has been set in motion by Putin and Trump, Neitzel said, referring of course to Russian President Vladimir Putin and President Donald Trump. We see Russia has announced large-scale exercises in Belarus. We see strong fear in the Baltic countries that during these exercises, Russian troops may cross the border. And we see that perhaps NATO's fifth circle, at least for the United States, may cease to operate. Deterrence is weakening, he added. However, the invasion of Lithuania is not a given, he said. Factors including how NATO generally reacts, what role Trump plays, what role the Europeans play, and whether peace in Ukraine is achieved in any form will play a role. In his opinion, Putin will not attack other European countries so long as he is still at war in Ukraine. Neitzel is not the only one to raise the alarm about the joint Russia and Belarusian military exercises called Zapad 2025, which translates to West 2025, scheduled to kick off in September. On April 29th, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky also warned that Russia is preparing for potential military aggression under the guise of these exercises. Look at Belarus this summer. Russia is preparing something under the guise of military exercises. This is how its new attacks usually start, he stated at the Three Seas Summit. But where will they attack this time? I don't know. Ukraine, Lithuania, Poland? God forbid. But we all have to be prepared. All our institutions are open to cooperation, he added. His statements echo those of his Commander-in-Chief Alexander Syrski. On April 9th, he told IB.ua that all exercises have some purpose, and one of these goals is the covert creation of offensive troop groups. The visibility of the exercises is the most acceptable way to relocate, redeploy troops, concentrate them in a certain direction, and create groups of troops. Zapad 2025 is the latest installment in a long-standing series of drills held between Russia and Belarus every 2 years since 2009, alternating between Zapad and another set of exercises dubbed Shield of the Union. The 2023 Shield of the Union drills, scheduled for September of that year, were cancelled, making this the first large-scale exercise since the unscheduled Allied Resolve 2022, which took place from February 10th to 20th, 2022. 4 days after the end of those exercises, despite strenuous denials that it had any intention of doing so, Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, including from Belarusian territory. So there's certainly a recent historical precedent to warrant fears of another invasion following these exercises. The Russians and Belarusians have been preparing for Zapad 2025, which will reportedly involve over 13,000 troops since at least January. According to Belaruski Hajun and OSINT, or Open Source Intelligence, a project that monitors the military activity of Russian and Belarusian troops on the territory of Belarus, there is a chance that the exercises may still be cancelled. Due to the continuation of the war in Ukraine, the Russian Federation may simply not have enough soldiers for both the war and the exercises. Russia is seemingly in the early stages of launching a major spring and summer offensive all along the front lines in eastern Ukraine, from Kherson in the south to Sumy and Kharkiv in the north. So that might well be an accurate prediction, particularly if Ukraine's latest attempt to counter-invade the Kursk region is successful. However, given the experiences of 2022, the possibility of a repeat is understandably not being taken lightly. Of course, Neitzel's warnings of an imminent Russian invasion of European countries beyond Ukraine are hardly the first, although he has certainly moved the timeframe for such an attack forward somewhat compared to European intelligence assessments. On February 14th, during the Munich Security Conference, Zelensky himself suggested 2026 as a possible invasion date. He stated that Putin planned to deploy up to 150,000 troops, primarily in Belarus, suggesting a possible buildup for future offensives against NATO countries. Based on all the information I've gathered from intelligence and other sources, I think he is preparing for a war against NATO countries next year, 2026, he said, adding that he could not be entirely sure. In March, Germany's Federal Intelligence Service, the BND, reported that Putin is preparing for a conflict with NATO. According to their assessment, Russia could be fully ready for a large-scale conventional war by 2030. Russia sees itself in a systemic conflict with the West and is prepared to implement its imperialistic goals through military force even beyond Ukraine, the report said. Earlier in June 2024, German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius told the German parliament that we must be ready for war by 2029. General Carsten Breuer, the German army's chief inspector, agreed with that assessment, suggesting that it will take 5 to 8 years for Moscow to reconstitute its armed forces from the grinding war in Ukraine. That also puts a 2029 deadline on NATO efforts to prepare for possible combat. NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte also fingered 2029 or 30 as a possible invasion date, warning in December that we are not ready for what's coming our way in 4 to 5 years. Numerous others have also warned about the prospects of another imminent Russian invasion, without specifying a timeframe. These include European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, who told the European Economic Congress in May 2024 that Putin's war is about redrawing the map of Europe. In January 2024, Georgita Vlad, Chief of Defense of Romania, warned that if he wins in Ukraine, the main target will be the Republic of Moldova. We will witness tensions in the Western Balkans. I am more than convinced that President Putin's policy will escalate in the near future. In the same month, NATO's Dutch Military Committee Chief Admiral Rob Bauer stated that the alliance must expect the unexpected and prepare for a Russian attack. And in December 2023, Belgian Army Chief Michel Hofman cautioned that Russia has already shown that they have the will to attack a neighbor and that it is absolutely possible that they will also have other ideas later, either in the south in Moldova or the Baltic states. Those are just a few of the military and political leaders and think tanks that have been raising the alarm about further aggression since Russia's invasion of Ukraine began. But there are signs that Neitzel's warnings about an attack in just a few months are well beyond paranoia. Last week, the Wall Street Journal reported that Russia is expanding its military presence along its borders with Finland and Norway in preparation for a potential face-off with NATO. According to the report, the Kremlin is planning to establish a new army headquarters in the Russian city of Petrozavodsk, about 100 miles east of the Finnish border. This new HQ will oversee tens of thousands of troops over the next several years, many of whom will be deployed to the area after the Ukraine war ends. At the same time, Russia is ramping up military recruitment and accelerating weapons production. In addition, according to the British Royal United Services Institute think tank, Russia is starting to hold back recently produced equipment from deployment to Ukraine and is instead reallocating some personnel to other regions, including the Baltics and the Nordics. However, this activity is far from a buildup. Many of the units usually stationed in the north have become combat ineffective while fighting in Ukraine. So this Russian activity is rebalancing and recapitalizing lost forces. It does therefore indicate that Russia is already starting to look beyond Ukraine. Intelligence services across Europe have also been voicing concerns. Over and above the BND report mentioned earlier, Lithuania's intelligence service, VSD, assessed that Moscow may not yet be ready to launch a full-scale attack on the alliance. However, it may attempt to test NATO with a limited military operation against one or more member states to gauge how seriously the bloc will uphold its collective defense obligations. The Danish Defense Intelligence Service, or DDIS, also warned in February that Russia could be ready to wage a large-scale war in Europe within the next 5 years. The assessment notes that Russia is rebuilding its armed forces to fight NATO on an equal footing, with financial and material support from China, North Korea, and Iran. While there is currently no threat of a regular military attack on the kingdom, it's likely that the military threat from Russia will increase over the coming years, it said. Dovetailing with the Institute of War's long-standing assessment, the DDIS also believes that a cessation or freeze of the war in Ukraine on terms favorable to Russia will free up significant Russian military resources for another European invasion. That ties into Neitzel's assessment that Trump's actions vis-à-vis Russia will play a big role in the likelihood of another invasion, which we'll discuss in more detail a bit later. Besides military buildup, there are other strong indications that Russia is preparing for a broader war with NATO, such as the rapid increase in subversive acts in European countries pinned on Russia. According to a Center for Strategic and International Studies report published in March, Russia is waging an escalating and violent campaign of sabotage and subversion against European and US targets in Europe. The report noted that the number of Russian attacks in Europe nearly tripled between 2023 and 24, having already quadrupled between 2022 and 23. Of particular concern is increased Russian military activity near key undersea communications cables. There are growing fears among NATO members that Putin could target underwater cables and critical infrastructure that are vital to global communications systems. For example, in January, the Belize-flagged Russian cargo vessel Vasily Shukshin loitered above undersea communications cables in the Pacific for weeks, raising concerns over potential Russian sabotage. Severing key undersea lines could cripple communications and disrupt global economies, a move that would undoubtedly serve Russian interests in any future war with NATO. Vessels from China or Russia were previously spotted roaming near cables in the Baltic Sea, off Norway, and around Taiwan. However, no damage was inflicted in any of those cases. Another reason to suspect that Russia might be planning something big and soon is its defense spending, which is increasing at a record pace. Russia's military expenditure is expected to reach around $137 billion in 2025, more than 6% of the country's GDP. That's compared to 3.6% before the war. The Russian army is also set to expand to 1.5 million troops, while the volume of weapons and equipment stationed along the NATO border is expected to grow by 30 to 50%, as noted by Bild's Russia edition. According to the International Institute for Strategic Studies' latest military balance report, released in February, Russia's military expenditure in 2024 was around $145.9 billion, or 6.7% of the country's GDP. That's over 40% higher than the previous year. Meanwhile, Europe's combined 2024 defense spending was $457 billion, more than 50% higher in nominal terms than it was in 2014, and 11.7% higher in real terms in the previous year. However, in terms of purchasing power parity, which takes into account the actual costs of economic inputs domestically, the Kremlin's military expenditure comes to around $461.6 billion. That means Russia is spending more on its military than the whole of Europe combined, adding weight to worries that Russia will be capable of attacking the continent once the war against Ukraine is over. However, not everyone agrees that Russia does in fact have any plans to attack NATO or EU member states in Europe. In a lengthy, data-packed report published in July 2024, the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft makes a compelling case that framing Russia's invasion of Ukraine as the first step in a plan of a broader European conquest is dangerously mistaken. The report suggests that Russia likely has neither the capability nor the intent to launch a war of aggression against NATO members. The authors highlight the fundamental differences between Russia's perception of Ukraine, which it's long regarded as both critical to its national security and integral to its history and culture, and its views of NATO countries, where the cost-benefit balance of aggression for Russia would be very different. Crucially, Russia is at an overwhelming conventional military disadvantage against the NATO alliance, and Putin is all too aware of this fact. While Russia certainly has the means to inflict serious damage in a conventional war with NATO, it would almost certainly suffer devastating defeat without nuclear escalation. Perhaps Chief of the British Defence Staff, Admiral Sir Anthony Radkin, sums the situation up best. The inescapable fact is that any Russian assault or incursion against NATO would prompt an overwhelming response. The thousands of Allied troops currently stationed in Poland and the Baltic states could draw on the 3.5 million uniformed personnel across the alliance for reinforcement. NATO's combat air forces, which outnumber Russia's 3-1, would quickly establish air superiority. NATO's maritime forces would bottle up the Russian Navy in the Barents and the Baltic, just as Ukraine pushed the Black Sea Fleet from Crimea. NATO has 4 times as many ships and 3 times as many submarines as Russia. With a collective GDP 20 times greater than Russia and a total defense budget 3.5 times more than Russia and China combined. Plus, NATO has the additional strategic depth of a population of over 1 billion. And sitting above all of this is NATO as a nuclear alliance. The biggest reason that Putin doesn't want a conflict with NATO is because Russia will lose, and lose quickly. So while Russia has clear military superiority over individual NATO states, especially in the Baltics, it is extremely unlikely it could exercise this advantage without triggering a broader war with the entire NATO alliance. Consider the specter of a Russian invasion of one or more of the Baltic states. The implicit assumption is that Russia could quickly overrun these nations before assistance from other NATO states arrived. In such a blitzkrieg scenario, Russia could thus gain substantial benefits without incurring the costs of a wider war with NATO. However, this assumption greatly underestimates the costs to Russia of aggression against NATO. Factors such as NATO air and naval dominance, the difficulty of conquering urban areas, NATO political commitments to the states on its eastern border, and Russian weaknesses revealed in the Ukraine conflict mean that Russian aggression against even NATO's weakest states would carry enormous risks and be unlikely to succeed. This cold reality is likely the reason why Putin and other Russian top brass like Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov have maintained a consistent position throughout the Ukraine war that further invasions of European nations are off the table. To be sure, various figures in the Russian media media have made belligerent statements threatening further aggression, and there have been several statements from influential figures to that effect. In December 2023, Mikhail Ulyanov, Russia's permanent representative to international organizations in Vienna, stated that Finland would be the first to suffer if war broke out between NATO and Russia, since they are our neighbors. Earlier that year, in May, former president and close Putin ally Dmitry Medvedev referred to temporarily occupied Poland and our Baltic provinces in a post on X. However, Putin himself has consistently swatted the notion of a Russian invasion of other European nations away. This is complete nonsense. The possibility of an attack on some other countries, on Poland, the Baltic states, the Czechs, it's just nonsense, he said in March 2024, adding that Russia has no aggressive intentions toward these states. More recently, in an interview on CBS's Face the Nation on April 24th, Lavrov dismissed US claims about Russia's intentions as disinformation. When asked about the possibility of Russia invading Europe, Lavrov has also consistently denied any such plans, stating that Russia's actions are defensive and aimed at securing its own interests. But can Europe trust them? That remains to be seen. Certainly, as suggested by Neitzel, Trump's actions could play a decisive role. It's fair to say that European leaders have been stunned by Trump's attempts at rapprochement with Putin in an attempt to hammer out a peace deal to end the war in Ukraine. In recent weeks, Secretary of State Marco Rubio has stated that US may move on to other priorities if a deal can't be reached soon. What that means is debatable. Trump has also made threatening noises about scaling back, if not withdrawing completely, from the US's involvement in NATO. That's likely the reason for Neitzel's fears that the US might not honor its Article 5 commitments to come to the defense of the Baltic states should Russia attack them. As the dominant military partner in the alliance, that would change the chessboard considerably, perhaps emboldening Putin. Certainly, the Europeans are taking that threat seriously, with a massive increase in defense spending and a push for increased militarization already in motion across the continent. Ultimately, it remains an open question whether this will be the last summer of peace in Europe for the foreseeable future. But perhaps if you're in Europe over the summer, it might be worth cherishing the Parisian latte, a day at the beach, or an all-nighter in Ibiza just a little bit more, just in case. But what do you think? How likely is a Russian invasion of other European countries this summer or beyond? Is Europe going to be ready and able to fight the Russians off if it happens? Please share your views in the comments below. And thanks for watching.